we'll just need to do some housekeeping for a minute or two here, and we'll bring the panelists back. Asking the panelists to start their videos again, please, and to unmute themselves.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's film, and we will get started shortly with the post-film discussions with our honored guests, John McHugo and Vincent Fean.
One moment, please.
I always like to take a moment of silence and just process all the rich information that these films provide, and today is no exception.
Okay, we are now live on Facebook also, and this session has been recorded. At the end of the program, you'll be able to go to Facebook and view this part of the program, which is the discussion session on Facebook, and share it with your friends.
Is the chat back on, Faisal, for
momentarily,
discussion?
Momentarily.
Okay. So we encourage you, if you have comments for our panelists or just in general about the topic of today's film, please put your comments in the chat. And if you have a specific question for our panelists, feel free to put that in the Q&A. Deanna Sapia is going to be responding to your chats, your comments. So
we have a couple of people with their hands raised. Nadia Stefan and Yasser Frage. If you raise them by mistake, please lower them down by clicking on the hand again. And if you have a pressing issue, please use the chat to tell us what's the issue that you have. And I see only one left. Nadia is left there.
Yeah, sometimes people press it by mistake, so it can happen.
Okay, so looks like Nadia has something. So. Okay, all right, so it looks like we're good as far as the chat. No hands left. Okay, so Krista, you can start with were we going to have our panelists give an introduction to the organization, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that would be a wonderful way to start.
Would you like to give us an overview of the Balfour project?
I'll be delighted to do that. Thank you. Thank you, Faisal. Thank you, Krista. And thanks to all our viewers for joining us today. As you will have seen from the film does not defend Lord Balfour, and neither do we. The name of our charity is the Balfour Project, because a few people got together in the UK about 15 years ago and decided to think through how Britain should mark the centenary of the Balfour Declaration in 2017. The charity grew from that gathering. And what do we do? We have a website, which is a repository of knowledge of the history of Britain in Palestine, and we want to be the go-to place for academics, for students, for people who want to know more about what Britain did. So the website is a good one, in my opinion, and the title is www.balfourproject.org. Our aims are educational. We ask the question at the end of that film, how should Britain respond to its responsibility? As a charity, we affirm that Britain does have a moral, political, even legal responsibility to change matters in Palestine, Israel. How do we go about that? Two or three things. One is a fellowship program of students, undergraduate or postgraduate in British universities, who work with us for an academic year on projects such as recognition of the state of Palestine, the plight of Masafa Yatta. There are several projects underway this year, and John McHugo is the mentor of those projects. We run webinars, thanks to Diana Safier, who's also on the call, roughly every 3 weeks, which are free and which are accessible via our website, where we try to give a platform to Palestinians and British academics, and indeed Israelis who oppose the occupation. So, for example, as speakers, we've had Raja Shehadeh, the author, Ramzi Baroud, recently Matthew Teller, who wrote a book about the 9 quarters of Jerusalem. And once a year, we hold a conference. And I'll end on that. The conference this year is on the 17th of May. We chose that date because it's the week of the Nakba. And our title, which is available again on our website, is Human Rights in Palestine, Responsibility and Accountability. Our aim in that gathering, which will be live and on Zoom on the 17th of May in the afternoon in the UK, is to focus not so much on the questions of 2 states, 1 state, partition, but on the current situation on the ground, which is a situation which I think most of us on this call fully know of, oppression and discrimination by one government against a people. So what can Britain and the international community, US, Canada, the countries of the speakers and of the viewers today, what can we do now in order to improve and rectify the situation that Britain left in 1948? I'll stop there, Faisal and Krista, and over to you.
John, would
Thank
you
you.
also like to briefly comment,
No,
or you want to just
I think
started?
Vincent's introduced the Balfour project and said
Okay.
what we need to say. I'm raring to go and get into the discussion on
excellent.
Q&A. Some very interesting questions I've seen in the chat box with one eye while I've been watching the film.
Well, I think the film just does an incredible job of providing that historical context and background. Many of our viewers are very familiar with the situation, and others are just delving into the topic. So I think it's really beneficial for everyone to have that context refresher or introduction, as the case may be. I think one of the most important things that the Balfour Project raises is this question of accountability. And you do mention a few things that you're calling for through the Balfour Project and ways that you are asking for that accountability to be implemented at the grassroots level, as well as looking to the parliament and government. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how important it is to view this this issue through that lens of accountability.
Yeah.
And
I
you
can
can
begin.
both comment on that.
Yeah, but yeah, John can certainly comment, and I will just begin by saying accountability is key. International law and respect for international law is key, and I'd ask John to speak to that point as a lawyer and a historian. We try as a charity to explore opportunities to influence civil society, our own parliament, and government. The focus is on Britain, but it is not unique to Britain, because this issue, as was said in the film, became a matter for the United Nations, which in a sense means it became a matter for all of us to address. What do we seek? We seek equal rights. We don't focus particularly on 1 state, 2 states, and that political outcome, frankly, because the political outcome is not on the horizon. But what is visible is discrimination and oppression today, and futile violence, frankly, in response to those facts. So what do we ask of civil society, parliament, government? Make a noise in civil society, use the democratic channels that are available in the West to energize government, which needs energizing, I have to say, and reach out to the people who know. Who knows most are the Palestinians themselves. Israelis who understand that the occupation and the current situation are actually against the long-term interests of Israel need to be heard as well. It isn't the mainstream voice coming out of Israel, but it is a voice from people like the Policy Working Group, Breaking the Silence, other groups that we know. On a domestic level in the UK, we need to motivate our government to get off the fence. It's actually, if anything, on the side of the fence that is Israel, rather than an even-handed approach. And we make a pitch to our own government to recognize the state of Palestine alongside Israel, but to recognize the state of Palestine, because that means parity of esteem for two peoples. And that was lacking in the Balfour Declaration, which was contradictory and in effect shuffled off the majority in the country to being non-Jewish communities. And that was wrong and needs to be righted. We don't seek an apology from the British government, we seek change of policy by the British government. I'll stop there, and perhaps John could say some words about the international law context.
Yes, the question focused on accountability, and as many of you will know, the difficulty is that international law, very often, it's really quite rare for a tribunal of any sort to decide a question of international law. Normally, it depends on the will of the international community and of states coming together. I don't want to use, well, I'm going to use it. We had that horrible expression, the coalition of the willing, at the time of the Iraq War. And I don't want to, and I certainly have no truck with the invasion of Iraq, which was both illegal and very myopic. But the point is that when states come together, they can do something. And contrast Ukraine at the moment and the huge support for Ukraine in the West, and the very small degree of support for Palestine. But there are many parallels to be drawn between the two. You have Russian troops occupying parts of Ukraine. You have Israeli troops occupying the occupied Palestinian territory. There are sometimes accountability mechanisms. Let us continue to hope that one day the International Criminal Court will get round to perhaps taking a few cases concerning Israel and Palestine. Let's also not forget that, I mean, we have in Britain, and I'm sure you have it in most of the other countries of people who are attending here today, we have something called the Geneva Conventions Act. And it is possible to bring war criminals who come to Britain to justice under that act. But of course, you have to know when they are coming. You have to have prepared your case, and you've got to be able to serve on them. And you need the consent of the Director of Public Prosecutions. But accountability is a difficult thing to enforce. There's no question about it. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be like that, but that's the way the world is. I think on the international law side more generally, a very important point to know, and this has just come to me, it hit me between the eyes, is blindingly obvious from reading the new edition of Avi Shlaim's The Iron Wall. If you look at all the negotiations from 1948 to now, you will find Israel was always insisting on its own rights in international law, but never willing to admit those of other countries. And that's, I think, a very important object lesson. And there's increasing pressure, certainly from people like us in Britain, but I'm sure from many of you in the USA and other countries, to say to governments, look, you have to go with the position in international law. You can't just brush it aside. And there is a new advisory opinion coming from the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences of Israel's occupation. This will probably go way beyond the 2004 opinion. And let's just hope that something comes out of that, because what it would do is clarify areas of international law. And then it would become very difficult for states to dispute those areas of international law. Today, it is very difficult for even a state like the USA, with its very strong pro-Israel lobby, to dispute the fact that settlements are illegal. And I think the reason for that is the 2004 advisory opinion. Let's hope there will be similar things when, let's hope about this time next year, there is a second opinion at the International Court on the legal status of the occupied territories. I'll stop at that point because I'm sure there are many other questions.
There are, and I'm trying to kind of pull them together and condense them. One of them is I think it'd be helpful if you could help our viewers understand why, for example, in the UK, the Labour Party has become so Zionist, and then also looking to the contributions of the UN and, of course, the United States to absolving or not holding Israel accountable for what's happening. How do we understand the one-sidedness of this? And is it really are we really, those who are that one-sided, is that really being Israel's best friend? Is it helping Israel? Is it helping the Jewish people? Is it helping calls for peace and justice? I wonder if you could just help our viewers understand why it's so one-sided and why it's so difficult for governments or to hold Israel accountable and to move this situation forward to some kind of equitable resolution.
Yeah, I could begin on that one. Thank you for the question. I spent 3 years in Jerusalem representing the British government, talking to Palestinians. Down the road in Tel Aviv was our ambassador to Israel, making the same points, the same policy points to Israelis and to the Israeli government. What the Palestinians have is international law on their side, and they have a grievance, a justified grievance. What Israel has is an established state, relations with most of the world, just about all the world except a few of the Arab states, a thriving economy, a military power, a claim to democracy, and academic and commercial links worldwide. So when I was making my case to London about this issue, the occupation in particular, because that was my geographical focus, Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, I had in my hand the international law issue and the visible, touchable, tangible grievance. Discrimination. One can call it apartheid if one wishes, but discrimination against one people, be it in Gaza with closure, be it in the refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria, be it in the West Bank with permit controls and demolitions and so on. No doubt about the impact of the occupation and the conduct of the occupation. Down the road in Tel Aviv, my counterpart had all the things I've just described. He had a 9 million population, self-proclaimed, but acknowledged by the West democracy, sharing intelligence information, selling and buying arms, trading, joint ventures in the pharmaceutical field, in cyber, you name it. And politically, the weight of Israel outweighed the real grievance of the Palestinians. Add to that the natural inclination of members of the Jewish community worldwide, not all, but many, to see Israel as a haven, after the Holocaust, a haven, a safe place, and the impact of the Israel lobby, which I needn't go into, but AIPAC and others. There is a UK equivalent to AIPAC related to the Conservative Party and to a lesser extent to the Labour Party. I'll just finish on your point, Krista, about the UK and the issue of anti-Semitism. This is a tricky area. There is anti-Semitism, there is no doubt. There is anti-Semitism worldwide, and there is anti-Semitism in the UK, and it is reprehensible. It's a form of racism that should be opposed, must be opposed. The current situation today, 2023, is that there is indeed anti-Semitism in the UK, but there is also a hesitation to speak out loud and speak clearly about the Palestinian cause. There's been a shrinking of our space to discuss this issue objectively in terms of international law, etc. And that's because there are entities in the Israeli lobby who are more than able, skilled in linking criticism of Israel to anti-Semitism. The linkage is not always true, far from it, but it's made, and it creates a kind of hush. Part of the work of the Balfour Project is to break that silence, to use another term, and to enable objective discussion. Not to discount anti-Semitism, it must not be discounted, it must be fought, but not to hush the message from Palestinians that their rights have been flouted and need to be attained.
Could I just add a couple of things to that? I agree with every word Vincent has said. We had a very interesting presentation to us in the Balfour Project from Alon Liel, the former Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, I think, who is now a peace activist. And he pointed out that although there's this great political influence of Israel when it comes to, shall we say, the hard realities of politics, where Israel has been losing is on the civil society front. And it is losing more and more. And although there are people who try to chill the debate and people who are, and I'd include myself here, are people who are sometimes inhibited from speaking as forcefully as they like because of all that. Nevertheless, what the new historians in Israel have achieved over the last 30 years, what we have achieved in international law that I've already mentioned, the fact that historical research is proceeding apace, and it all by and large confirms the Arab narrative, the Palestinian narrative, if you like. And I think this is gradually making a sea change. It's taking time. You have people like J Street in America who are doing incredibly good work. We have Yachad, for instance, in Britain doing similar work among Jews. I'll just stop there. Briefly, on the Labour Party, I am less pessimistic than the questioner seemed to be, judging by how you paraphrased their question, Krista. Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, who, let's remember, is a human rights specialist, has told the Labour Friends of Palestine in the Middle East that recognition of the state of Palestine is still a Labour Party policy. And with all due respect to Jeremy Corbyn and to people like Ken Livingstone, someone who was politically very close to them, when they were challenged by people, they did not. I don't think they handled the debate. They didn't deal with it very well. And I think these people, and I think they are both experienced politicians, and I think there's a bit of a political failing there, because they could so easily have reassured a lot of people on the anti-Semitism front, and they were given the opportunity to do so, and in my humble opinion, they did not.
Thank you for those comments.
Krista?
Yes.
I have a question for
Sure.
the esteemed panelists. The Palestinians' position really, with respect to Britain and its role during the Mandate era, is that Britain was given a mandate to civilize the Palestine, basically, and instead they decided to give it away in the form of a national home for Zionists, and proceeded to suppress Palestinian resistance by force, particularly from 1936 to 1938, to the point where the Palestinians lost any ability to resist the Zionist forces that were there, and thus facilitated, aided, and abetted the takeover of Palestinian land and territory to establish a state, and basically disinherited the Palestinians. So who do the Palestinians see about that? Obviously, we feel Britain committed a major crime against the Palestinians, and the Palestinians obviously have not forgotten that. So who do we see about that, and what court in the world do we go to? And does Britain understand the gravity of what they have done to the Palestinians?
I'll start, and then perhaps John to come in. But your last point, Faisal, do we understand? Not enough, not enough. Politicians generally have a very short attention span, a very short memory, and they look forward to the next election because that's the next challenge. So asking our politicians, which we do, to look back to what was happening in the 19th century in Palestine and the first half of the 20th, they're reluctant to look back. Their focus is often more domestic than overseas. And we act as a kind of conscience. Not alone, the churches and members of the Jewish community who think that Israel would be a better place without the occupation, for instance, are making their views known too. On the question of who do you talk to? Well, there's a variety, but in the end, it's the government that matters, because it's the government that sets the policy, allocates the funding, makes the alliances that John referred to, the coalition of the willing, whatever it may be. And again, as John said, international law ultimately depends on the teeth that states give it. Our wish in the Balfour Project is that international law should be the yardstick, should be the measure of policy, not should be shelved, but should be central. And in those terms, what happened to the Palestinians over time, but in 1948 in particular, needs remedy. As I said at the beginning, we don't particularly seek an apology from the British government. Others do, Palestinians often do seek an apology. Our focus from within the UK is more on change of policy, because the future is before us. It's a truism, it's what matters. Improving the lives of Palestinians tomorrow. And that's the focus of our conference in May. Not so much apology, not so much two states, one state, but what can be done now across the world, but starting where we live in the UK, to make a better fist of things than we have so far, knowing that leaving the issue to the two parties is a recipe for continued occupation, continued discrimination.
I guess the question.
No, sorry, Faisal. Faisal, yeah.
The question a lot of people are always ask is, did Britain have the right to issue the Balfour Declaration? Did they really own Palestine, or were they just caretakers of it and had a responsibility to act in a fiduciary responsibility on behalf of the residents, which were predominantly Palestinian at the time?
Yeah. John, over to you.
They absolutely had a fiduciary duty. It's very important to mention that. The Balfour Declaration, or shall we say the letter from Arthur Balfour to the chairman of the Zionist Federation, it was just a letter expressing a view of the cabinet as to what government policy should be. It was a purely political document. Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, which is mentioned in the film actually, refers to the sacred trust of civilization. And that was for Britain, and the Palestinians did not want Britain to stay after World War I anyway, but stay they did. But the price Britain had to pay was signing up to its role as a mandatory power, which meant it should have abided by Article 22 and seen the progression of Palestine towards independence as a sacred trust of civilization, an obligation binding on Britain. Now, because we talk about the Balfour Declaration so much, that often gets forgotten. And it ought to be emphasized much, much more, because although, as I said, the Balfour Declaration was originally just a political thing, Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations was legally binding on Britain. Then you come to the rather complicated area of the mandate document that Britain proposed with some assistance from Dr. Weizmann, but no assistance from any Arab representatives. None of them were consulted. That ended up becoming the document to implement Britain's sacred trust. And that is where you have the Balfour Declaration put in there, and where it becomes a legal document, if you like. But there are a couple of things that I think are very often forgotten. One is that the Palestine Mandate did have an obligation. One of the obligations was on Britain to establish representative institutions. Now, all the other mandates in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and I'll include Transjordan for these purposes, all had their own democratically elected parliaments set up with universal male suffrage. I think they were all done basically in the first half of the 1920s. That did not happen in Palestine. It should have. And that was another big failing on the part of Britain. So Britain does have this big historic responsibility, which it would rather not have to acknowledge. It's got other historic responsibilities to acknowledge, but let's just talk about this one. But we in the Balfour Project feel that if we can get Britain to focus much more on this history, and the film was produced from the point of view of a British audience. If it had been made by Palestinians, I'm sure it would have been different in some ways. But the point was to show Britain's role, Britain's culpability in how all this happened, because at the end of the mandate, Britain just ran away. It didn't. What it did was it let the Yishuv, the Jewish community, proclaim a sovereign state. It had an obligation to prepare to lead the Palestinians to that point, so that they could have at the very least proclaimed their sovereign state, but it had given them absolutely no opportunity to do that. Arguably, too, well, I would say the presumption should have been too, that it should have been a single state in those days, because there was a Palestinian majority and there was not democratic consent to the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine. Another big problem. So you have all those problems, And what did Britain do? Britain ran away, leaving the Palestinians stateless. They became persons without a passport. They didn't have national institutions because Britain had not encouraged them to build them up. One hears a lot about Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, who was the Palestinian leader. Now in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and so on, and Egypt, although that wasn't a mandate, national leaders came to the fore through elections. Britain had prevented that in Palestine. And in fact, so there you are. So Britain carries a major share of blame for what happened. The blame lies squarely at Britain's door. It is something that Britain should acknowledge.
So John, can we say that when Britain implemented the Articles of Mandate, that those Articles of Mandate were in conflict or inconsistent with the League of Nations authorization or the mandate that was given to Britain?
Well, the Palestinians who negotiated with Britain or tried to negotiate with Britain always maintained that the text of the mandate of Palestine was illegal. Mm-hmm. And it was always a major demand of the Palestinians that the mandate of Palestine should be withdrawn. And if they were going to have a new mandate, they should have had one that was a bit like that for, say, Syria. But that did not happen. The difficulty with that argument, which in terms of justice, I think is perfectly, is absolutely right. But the difficulty is the mandate was lodged at the League of Nations as a document, and it was ratified by the League. So that meant that in terms of international law, as it stood at the time, it was a legally binding document, even if it failed to implement everything that it was meant to implement, namely the sacred trust of civilization. But it's very often forgotten that the opening words of the Palestine mandate, the paragraphs beginning with whereas, and it begins by referring to Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. So the whole of the Palestine mandate should have been intended to implement Article 22. And of course, Britain failed in that.
Thank you.
I think one of the strategic and just really smart moves on the part of the Balfour project there's a tandem, a two-pronged tandem here between reaching out to the general public and also holding our leaders accountable. And in the spirit of democracy, we know that when our leaders don't follow through on doing the right thing, that the people have to hold their leaders accountable. So I wonder if you could some of our questions are talking about the roles of various communities that are non-governmental, such as the Christian Zionism movement in the US and the UK, the Church of England, and then also you mentioned just the complexity of anti-Semitism, the layer that adds to this, to the difficulty in addressing this whole issue. So I wondered if you could also talk about the importance of the Jewish community, particularly in the United States and the UK, in helping move this forward. Because obviously there's some really great work being done in those areas.
Yeah, if I can begin on that one. Thank you, Krista. To focus on the Jewish community, it is diverse worldwide. It is diverse. It's diverse in the UK. The leadership, self-proclaimed leadership of the Jewish community, is the Board of Deputies of British Jews, and there's a thing called the Jewish Leadership Council. There are strands of opinion in the British Jewish community deeply concerned by two things. One is the occupation, and the other is the current turmoil in Israel and the attempt to subordinate the Supreme Court to the Knesset. Now, Palestinians rightly say that the Supreme Court was never their guarantee of equal rights. Far from it. The Supreme Court managed to reconcile itself to abuses of human rights on the grounds of security, Israel's security. So it's not too surprising that when you see protests in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem about the threat to democracy in Israel, you don't see many Palestinians on the street. Within the UK, there are strands of opinion, diverse strands of opinion in the Jewish community. We talk to Yachad, which is one of those strands. There's another one called Na'amod, which is more activist in terms of demonstrations. I come round to the question about Zionism, Christian Zionism. It isn't a hugely strong movement in the United Kingdom, but it's here. It's a lot stronger in the US. It's based on in my opinion, is based on a rather willful misunderstanding of what it is to be a Christian, because it seems to be sacrificing the Palestinian Christians for the sake of something biblical, which may or may not happen. And I think the true, how shall I put it, the true face of Christianity is love for your fellow human being, respect and compassion, and a respect for justice. So I don't see Christian Zionism as a major element in the political thinking of the United Kingdom today. It was in the time of Lloyd George and Balfour, for sure. Less so today. We live in a very secular world. But the need to persuade, to advocate, to shout about what's happened and is happening, because the Nakba is today, to the Palestinians is real. As a charity, we are careful not to be politically partisan, because charities are not that, but we can advocate for equal rights. We can advocate for consciousness of a wrong, and we can advocate for change. And we try to focus on our own civil society, parliament, government, because we live here and it's the most effective thing we can do. But reaching out across the Atlantic and across the world is also vital, because no one government is going to move on its own. Governments talk to each other. In New York, for instance, the British, French talk to the Americans in the UN Security Council as permanent members with a veto. Talk rather less to Russia and China these days, also with a veto power. And when Britain gave this problem, relinquished this problem to the UN, it was one way of getting out of trouble for the Labour government of the day. But it was also an acknowledgement of the fact that this is an international issue. It is not a domestic Israeli issue, far from it. It is not a bilateral issue. It's an international problem. It's an international problem where people are suffering. And the way to address it is internationally finding a way to prod the conscience of our governors, of our governments, to acknowledge their responsibility. Maybe Britain with the primary share, but we all share it. The United States these days is a far more powerful country than Britain and continues to say we have Israel's back. I don't mind personally people having Israel's back, but I don't like the oppression of the Palestinians, and I'm against it. And I think those two issues need to be separated. Protection of the state of Israel from the plight and the suffering of the Palestinians. So coming back to what the charity can do, we can advocate, we can try to educate. We're not huge, we're aware of the realities on the ground, because we do give those platforms to Palestinians speaking to us from Gaza, from Ramallah, from Nablus, to tell us the reality. And then we try to use that knowledge to widen the circle of awareness and to prod government to act consistently with international law.
I'll just add a couple of very brief things to that. As regards the churches, there is relatively little Christian Zionism in today's churches in Britain, as Vincent has just pointed out. But what the churches are very keen on is social justice, the upholding of human rights, the upholding of international law, and that swamps whatever Christian Zionist impulse there may be. All the major churches, Anglican, Catholic, Methodist, Church of Scotland, are all very firm on that. The other point I would like to mention is about the Israel and its judiciary. 2 years ago, we had a conference on Israel and Palestine in search of the rule of law. And the recently retired president of our Supreme Court, who incidentally was the first woman ever to hold the post, Brenda Hale, honoured us by giving us an opening address. And of course, as president of our Supreme Court, she'd had many, she knew the president of the Israeli Supreme Court, and they had met each other on formal occasions over many years. But when she went to Palestine, when she went to Ramallah, despite her respect for her Israeli opposite number, she heard from Palestinians that Palestinians do not expect justice from an Israeli court. And I think that's something that I think more and more people should focus on. Now, it may not be a question of the judicial conscience of the judges. It could be because of Israel's discriminatory laws. It could also be because of the, some of the interpretations of, shall we say, the Zionist ethos. Those elements, within the Zionist movement, people who believe that Jews should be allowed to settle in the occupied Palestinian territory. But nevertheless, there is, I don't know if Faisal would like to comment on this, but I don't think that a Palestinian can really expect much justice from an Israeli court, except perhaps on some very narrow grounds.
I think, just to answer your question, we showed a film about a year ago here about an Israeli lawyer, and that she defended Palestinians in Israeli courts. She participated in 188 cases, and she won one of them.
Yeah, well,
that gives you an idea of what kind of courts Israel has for Palestinians. They're military courts, and where the military is the judge and the law and everything, and Palestinians have zero chance of any justice in front of these courts. So it's really it's a kangaroo court, like they say. And we don't see any point in going to these courts.
So if the court is not behind the Palestinians, which we know, and yet we have this right-wing government in Israel, we have judicial proposals that severely undermine whatever there is of democracy in Israel, and this massive response from Israelis to that particular issue. I just wonder if either of you can speak to the possibility that raised awareness among the Israeli public on the judicial front could somehow transfer over to the undemocratic policies and practices of the state of Israel. How much faith can we have in the Jewish Israeli public?
I think we need to have faith. We need to have hope. It comes back to that. Palestinians give us hope by their resilience, and I'm not being patronizing. They truly give us hope by their resilience, by their willingness to sacrifice to stay on the land which is theirs. I think that the turmoil in Israel can be positive. I was present in Jerusalem for, I think, 2 of Netanyahu's many elections. I was there from 2010 to 2014. I think he had 2 in that time. And the Palestinian issue was not on the agenda. It was the issue that mattered, but it was the issue that was not in the manifestos. Where we are now, and I touched upon it, where we are now is that a vocal, possibly majority of Israelis, we don't know the numbers, except the people who turn out on the street, and that's pretty big, are opposed to the religious rigor of the coalition government under Netanyahu and the blatant attempt to torpedo the Israeli rule of law, which, as I've said, is not particularly, it isn't intended to address the Palestinian concerns. The fact that people are talking about democracy and saying that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not a Democrat if he does what he wants to do, that, I think, helps to get a read across to the 55, 56-year occupation, to the 2018 nationality law in Israel, which subordinates Palestinian Israelis or Palestinians inside 48 to Jews, and says so. That read across is not happening yet, but this story isn't over yet. We're on pause for Ramadan and Easter and Pesach. It will come back. I heard that a couple of the Palestinian members of the Knesset, Odeh and Tibi, were out on the streets for one of the recent demonstrations. The more we collectively, those on this call who care, and I think everybody on this call cares, about Palestinian rights, to draw the attention of our own rulers to the fact that whatever Israel may be, it is not a democracy in the occupied Palestinian territory, but it is the government that rules. It rules the security of Palestinians and abuses the security of Palestinians on a daily basis in Gaza, in the West Bank, even in East Jerusalem. So it's partly up to us to make that comparison. And just to go back to one thing John said, he made the comparison with Ukraine. It is the case that the laws that Israel is breaking by the annexation of East Jerusalem and the Golan are the same laws that Putin has broken by the annexation of Crimea and other parts of Ukraine. Now, politicians don't like making that link. They really don't. They say, well, there must be some other way of expressing this. We need to pin that down as best we can, because the truth, it may hurt and it may be difficult to get our governments, I'm talking about the West rather than the global South, but the West, to acknowledge that what Putin has done wrong in Ukraine, Israel did wrong, back in whenever the annexation of East Jerusalem happened, 1967, and then ratified in 1980, and that the same laws are being broken, and that therefore the same considerations should apply to the people who make the breach.
Could I just add in on that point, Vincent? if you're writing to your congressperson or whatever, you could point out that Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem, for instance, or the Golan, provides a very helpful precedent to Putin. It helps Putin justify his position. And that is a point that I don't think has really, hit the headlines as much as it should do. In fact, it's hardly been noticed at all.
Well, and a flip side of that is also, the global community, the international community, particularly the Western nations, have the capacity to mobilize very quickly to make change or to stand up for international law and justice, for example, in the case of Ukraine, and have chosen not to do that in the case of Palestine. So in that regard, it's also a very interesting legal framework to analyze.
Absolutely.
Going back a little bit to history, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of the Soviet Union, to the extent that they were in the picture, even going back to Sykes-Picot to some extent, and voting at the UN and subsequent actions, and how that has affected the situation. I'm just building off of some of the questions that have been coming in, to the extent that that's relevant, since we're just talking about the Soviet Russia.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have too much to say about the Soviet Union. The current situation in the UN is bad. We have 3 versus 2, and you need consensus to get a decision out of the UN Security Council. The 3 being UK, France, US, and the 2 being China, Russia. Partly stemming from Iraq, Libya, various international crises, where one side thinks that the other cheated. There's an interesting situation with Russia. There are 1 million people who left Russia, left the Soviet Union at the fall of the Soviet Union, and are now many of them in Israel. Some in US, some around the world, but many in Israel. The vast majority Jews, some Orthodox, but the vast majority Jews. And the result of that arrival is to increase, as it appears, the voting pattern moving to the right in Israel. It's not the only factor, but it's a factor. What we see between Israel and Russia, Putin's Russia, is a kind of modus vivendi over Syria, an understanding that they don't conflict. That when Russia is doing something in Syria, the Israelis don't interfere. When the Israelis, as they have done, bomb Damascus and elsewhere, the Russians don't retaliate and don't interfere with the flights of the fighter jets. It's a complex relationship, but it is not one of opposition. It is not one of antagonism between Russia and Israel. When Putin invaded Ukraine, Israel sat on the fence for quite a while. When I was in Jerusalem, the main Russian interest, political interest, was in convening an international meeting in Moscow to discuss the final status issues, the issues between the PLO and Israel. It never happened. The question never really arose. In my time, John Kerry tried. I personally give him credit for that. I don't know him and he doesn't know me, but I personally give him credit for that because he did try. But the 2 parties, A, are so disproportionately powerful, and secondly, the Netanyahu aim was to play Obama long and wait for him to go. And he played Kerry and did not engage in any final status negotiations worthy of the name. It's But to try and come back to your point, Krista, today's Russian role is minimal. Today's Chinese role is minimal politically. Economically, it's different, but politically, I don't expect initiatives from either of those two states to address the fundamentals. We wait for more than management of the crisis from the US administration and an attempt to shrink the crisis without actually addressing the fundamentals. The work that you're doing and the work that our viewers are doing in the US matters to try to break through that kind of inertia. We have similar inertia in the UK, and we are doing our best to break through here.
I think we're about to wrap here. We're a little bit over time. I do appreciate our panelists taking the time to be with us today. Thank you so much, Sir Vincent Fean, and thank you, John. I appreciate all the insight and the information you provided, and thanks also to the Balfour Project for creating this film. This film is an important documentary, certainly as far as representing some of the facts that happened. And as any film of that length of 18 minutes, obviously we don't expect it to cover every single angle, every single detail. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of comments by the audience in terms of things that the film did not cover. But certainly there are other opportunities to bring that up and address it. And we hope to see the two of you on further programming with us in the near future. And we look forward to collaborating with your organization on matters related to Palestine and Britain, for that matter. And thank you, Krista, for joining us. Thanks to our audience who joined us on Facebook and those who joined us on Zoom. And we look forward to seeing you again next week. We will be announcing programming shortly. And thanks, everybody. And as we say at the end, ma salama.
Ma salama.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Vincent. It's our pleasure.
It's a pleasure. All the best.
Thank you. All the best.